Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, wie immer heiße ich Sie sehr herzlich willkommen beim Schweizerischen Institut für Auslandforschung in diesem Herbstsemester an der Universität Zürich. Ladies and gentlemen, a very, very warm welcome to all of you, as always, at the Swiss Institute for International Studies, tonight here at Zurich University. A special welcome goes to our guest of honor and distinguished speaker, the great and highly influential writer, Elif Shafak. Dear Elif, we are honored and pleased to have you with us. It was a long-term wish to have you here. Now you are here in real life, and thank you again for that very, very warm welcome. Difficult and challenging times ask for good and sustainable answers. Literature was always and will always be a glorious and adventurous way to tell and teach us about our human condition, who we are, how we deal with life, what our fears and concerns might be, but also, of course, what we can hope for the present as well as for the future, beyond the mortality of the individual. Elif Shafak is not only a fantastic writer, whose books are widely read around the globe and won her many prizes. She is also a scholar who wrote her thesis on politology and teaches as a professor at numerous distinguished universities, such as Oxford University and other hotspots of genius. And she is a very courageous essayist and speaker to defend the human rights, women's rights, freedom of speech, and the mutual understanding of different cultures, which also means to put and promote critical questions. The Turkish-British writer was born in 1971 in Strasbourg, Alsace, and writes in Turkish and English, eventually also in French. Novels like The Bastard of Istanbul, no associations please, The 40 Rules of Love, 10 minutes, 38 seconds in this strange world, or just recently, The Island of Missing Trees, in German, Das Flüstern der Feigenbäume, brought her huge acclaim. A year ago, Elif Shafak published a fascinating book with a most telling title, How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division. It is nothing less than a plea for conscious optimism. There is, however, no division so far, as much as I can see, in this hall, where Winston Churchill in 1946 gave his famous speech, Let Europe Arise. Instead, we are fascinated and united here to hear, Elif, you, and how you perceive the world and what we can do for a better and sustainable understanding towards civilizations which are worse of their title. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It was so generous of you, and I'm very thankful, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm also very much looking forward to your questions, your comments. If anything I say doesn't make sense, please share it with me. I would love to turn this into a dialogue together. So if that's okay, I'm going to speak a little bit about my background, my literary journey, how I see the world today, where we are right now, this major crossroads that we are at. But then let's open the floor and then carry on with your questions, with your comments together. I call myself a storyteller, but the way I see it, for me, being a storyteller means you love stories, you love language, you love the rhythm of words, right? You're in love with these things. But it also means you're interested in silences. So it's not only stories, but also silences. The way I see it, being a storyteller means that you want to give more voice to those silences, and anyone who feels silenced, anyone who feels voiceless. So I love the kind of fiction that pays more attention to the periphery rather than the center, and tries to make the invisible a bit more visible, tries to make the unheard a bit more heard, right? And change this power imbalance. The way I see it, I think at the heart of literature, there's rebellion, there's resistance, and there's a desire to rehumanize people who have been dehumanized. These are issues that I feel passionate about. But if I may tell you a little bit about my own background, yes, I was born in France, but I was not raised in France. Shortly afterwards, my parents got separated. The first house that I grew up in was actually, or that I was brought into as a toddler, as a baby, was full of immigrants, was full of leftist students, lots of tobacco, smoking Gauloise, dreaming of revolution, reading Jean-Paul Sartre, but not so much Simone de Beauvoir. So, from that environment, when my parents got separated, my father stayed in France, and my mom brought me to Turkey, to Ankara, to my grandmother's house. And that was a completely different environment. So I found myself in a very patriarchal, very inward-looking, very conservative neighborhood, but in the house of a matriarch. And that was my grandmother. And her house was full of superstitions, a lot of, oral storytelling, irrational, you might say, but a very vivid, colorful world, which left an impact on me. And I think being raised by a grandmother also taught me that there are different paths to knowledge. There are people in this world who have amazing diplomas from very glamorous universities, but you wouldn't call them wise. There are people in this world who perhaps didn't have the chance to have a great education, but they are so wise. And my grandmother was like that. She had been denied a proper education. She wasn't a very well-educated woman, and yet she wholeheartedly supported women's education, and she was a very wise woman. And the second thing that left a big impact on me was because my mother had come back as a young divorcee, she had nothing to rely on, no career, no money at the time. Had my grandmother not supported her, she would immediately be married off, usually to someone older, and our lives would be probably very different. But it was my grandmother who said, no, you should go back to university, because she had dropped out of university thinking love was enough, love was all she needed. So when her marriage failed, she had no diploma. And so it was my grandmother who supported her and said, you go back to university, you have a career, you build, your choices in life, and until the day you're ready, I will raise my granddaughter. The reason why I'm sharing this personal story is because what left a big impact on me was the solidarity between these two women. I'm a big believer in women empowering women. And I think it means nothing if we have a few successful women in media, a few successful women in finance, a bunch of women there. It means nothing unless we empower each other and we realize that we're in this together. So what they did, that kind of sisterhood, that kind of support mechanism that these two women established, changed my life. I think when women support each other, the impact of that goes beyond generations. For me, I mentioned that literature was, a bit of a rebellion, resistance. I should also tell you perhaps that I don't see literature necessarily as autobiographical. Of course, there are always elements of our own selves from, we project. But what I'm more interested in is transcendental, just trying to go beyond the limits of the self that is given to us. I'm interested in the kind of literature that allows us to become someone else for a few hours, for a few days. I think that's a very humbling exercise. It's good for the mind, but it's good for the soul. Usually we're always rushing, from one place to another. We're very sure of our own truths, of our own certainties. But when you read someone else and then you connect with them, there's a chance that you might understand, I might understand better, even someone I might have regarded as my other until that point. So through stories, I think we realize actually the other is my brother. The other is my sister. I am the other, So that inner garden, those individual connections is something that I cherish. And I think it's also something that we sorely need in today's world, because I believe we're living in a world that has an empathy deficit. In many ways, I see the world we're living in as the age of anxiety. I think this is the age of angst. It's almost like an existential angst that's affecting all of us. Some people are more ready to talk about it, some of us less so, but there's an uncertainty in the air. There's an anxiety in the air that's affecting all of us. It is also the age of anger. It's the age of fear, frustration, bewilderment, confusion. So we deal with lots of negative emotions as human beings. It is a moment in time when it's not easy to be a woman, when it's not easy to be young. For those of you who are young, I think it's so hard to be young in today's world. The problem is we don't like to talk much about negative emotions. But I think we should. Rather than trying to behave as if they don't exist, I'd rather talk about them. I'd rather also talk about mental health. It pains me to see sometimes mental health being treated as if it's a problem that only some people, on the edge of the society suffer from. I think we're all dealing with mental health issues at a moment like this. But for me, the issue is, how do we, once we recognize the existence of these emotions in our lives, can we see them as a source of raw energy and try to turn them into something more positive, more constructive, both for ourselves as individuals, but also for our communities? The writer Toni Morrison, she has this beautiful essay in which she says, I feel so angry sometimes. And she's right to feel angry. She observes the injustices, the widening inequalities, which is worse right now. And she says in this essay, I feel furious. But then I go and I sit down and I write. So it's not whether we're angry or not, or whether we're anxious or not, whether we're frustrated or not, but what do we do with our anger is a question, or what do we do with our anxiety is, for me, the main question. To be honest, I think if from time to time we don't find ourselves overwhelmed with these negative emotions, maybe we're not really following what's happening in the world. When we do follow, of course, it affects us. But that's okay. There's only one emotion that really worries me, and that is the lack of all emotions. It's numbness, it's apathy, it's indifference. I try to read the memoirs of survivors, people who have survived the darkest chapters in human history, including the Holocaust, including civil wars, ethnic violence, genocides. And there's one thing very interesting, the survivors are asking, they're saying, how is it possible that such atrocities can happen on such a large scale? How is it possible that neighbors can start betraying neighbors, people you were friends with until yesterday? Is it because human beings are evil by nature? And many survivors are saying, actually, there are some evil people, but their numbers are, relatively speaking, small. So how do you explain the fact that atrocities, horrific things can happen on a wider scale? So the answer that the survivors are giving us is maybe the opposite of kindness is not necessarily wickedness. Maybe the opposite of, good is not necessarily evil. Maybe the opposite of good is numbness. The moment we become indifferent, desensitized, disconnected, the moment we stop caring. So all I'm trying to say is, yes, this is the age of angst, but I think it would be a much difficult world to live in if it turns into the age of apathy. And we are at that threshold almost, because sometimes we feel so small, we feel so helpless. You know, climate change is so huge. What can I do as an individual? What's happening in Afghanistan is heartbreaking, but what can I do as an individual? The moment we start seeing ourselves as small and everything else as so huge and impossible to affect, I think that's the threshold when we moved into the age of apathy. And that's something that scares me. The reason why I'm mentioning all of this is because I think stories can make a difference. Literature can make a difference. Art can make a difference. But also sisterhood can make a difference. Solidarity can make a difference. We are at this moment in time when we need to connect beyond borders, beyond the tribes that we have been pushed into. And we can do that. And we can hear each other's voices. I also think in the age we're living in right now, we are bombarded by information. And the truth is, we are not processing this much information. There are very interesting studies that show if you go to a talk, and if the talk is given or based mostly on facts, statistics, graphics, and numbers, the next day, around midday, we wake up, we go on about our own lives. Around midday, we have already forgotten around 56-60% of the talk. But if the same talk is given to us or conveyed through emotions, through stories, personal stories, then we remember. And we remember for a longer time. I think Maya Angelou said this in such a beautiful way. She said, people might forget what you have done, people might forget what you've said, but they will never, ever forget how you made them feel. So how we make each other feel in terms of respecting each other as equal individuals, respecting basic human dignity. These are the things that have long-term effects. I believe in that. I think we have way too much information and we have over-romanticized information. You will remember in late 1990s, early 2000s, there was so much optimism in the world. And back then it was tech optimists who were the biggest optimists. They were telling us that thanks to the proliferation of digital technologies, the whole world was going to become a democracy. But where we are right now, I think we have too much information, but very little knowledge and even less wisdom. So how can we change this ratio? Information is fast food. It's just snippets, and we don't process it. But knowledge requires us to slow down. I think knowledge cannot be rushed. For knowledge, we need books. We need investigative, in-depth, slow journalism. We need spaces like this where we can hear each other's voices. And hopefully for wisdom, we need to bring emotions and the mind and the heart together. So if you'd like, I will stop here. But the very last idea that I want to leave you with, how can we move forwards? I think we need to recognize that we're all dealing with lots of negative emotions. We need to recognize that a world full of apathy would be a much more difficult place to live in. But one more thing that I want to very briefly talk about is identity. I also think we're living in a world in which we're constantly pigeonholed, and we are being told that we can only have single threads of identity. But I think that's wrong, because in reality, we all have multiplicity inside. So diversity is not necessarily something that exists outside, but inside as well. When I look at myself, I am an Istanbulite. I love Istanbul. I think it's very visible in my work. I'm Turkish, of course, and I feel attached to the culture, the people, oral culture, youth, minorities. But at the same time, I feel connected to the Balkans. So put me next to a Greek author, or a Bulgarian, or a Bosnian, or a Romanian author. I feel like I have so much in common with them. Equally, I have elements from the Middle East. So this time put me next to a Jordanian author, or an Iranian, or an Egyptian, or a Syrian author. Again, I have so much in common with them. I also consider myself European. The values that I share, the values that I uphold. Over the years, I became attached to London. I became a Londoner. I became a British citizen. And despite what politicians have been telling us in the UK, because of this Brexit saga, I want to call myself a citizen of the world or a citizen of humanity. So rather than thinking of identity as a singular, monolithic thing, I want to think of it as more fluid, like concentric circles. And I think it's possible to love where you come from, to care about the culture of your ancestors, but at the same time feel connected to humanity. The problem is we're living in a world that never, ever encourages our own multiplicity or the diversity within our societies. So if I may leave on that note, I think diversity matters, not only diversity within our societies, but also the diversity within. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elif, for this wonderful introduction to our discussion. I think it's also a message for the young people to have hope and to find themselves. Let me ask a personal question. How do you manage all these problems you just mentioned daily by daily? Because you wake up and you have to face the world and it's bad news and politics and whatever. Then you have to deal with that and make or establish a sort of a mindset to turn it into sort of patterns of hope. How does that work?
Yes, you very kindly early on mentioned this conscious optimism. You know, sometimes I jokingly think I can't be an optimist because I'm Turkish. You know, it's not in my DNA.
Is this a contradiction?
Perhaps, because I think if you open a map of Europe and if you trace the Danube, the blue Danube, with your finger, as you move eastward, I think the level of optimism drops. Right? So by the time you reach Romania, Hungary, towards the Black Sea, we're not very optimistic. But joking aside...
Neither, by the way.
I'm glad to hear that.
It's not symmetric on the other way.
Yeah. But the thing is, I have a positive view on pessimism. And that is because I think it's okay for the mind a little bit more pessimistic if we can keep the hearts more hopeful. And of course, Gramsci himself, the Italian thinker, he has this beautiful metaphor. He talks about the pessimism of the intellect, but the optimism of the will, the optimism of the heart. That's the moment we're in right now. So it is okay for the mind to be a bit more pessimistic if it makes us more alert, more aware of what's happening. But we also need hope. And I think hope is going to come always from our fellow human beings.
As a writer, you are very creative, and creative persons have also probably an optimistic view on the world because they have to think of what they do should be acclaimed and have success. But there is also the other perspective that you think, okay, do I really reach the people with my work? Is it good enough? How do you deal with these two sides of an artist who is in general optimistic, but also at the same time self-critic?
Yeah, of course, and we should always have doubt. I mean, doubt is a big part of our own, I think, work. I don't like, absolutism. I don't like this extreme certainty of our own truths or clashing certainties. I think there should always be room for doubt. And that's what an proper intellectual exchange is. That's what we've forgotten in today's world, because a real intellectual exchange, in my opinion, means I'm here to talk to you, I'm here to listen to you. I have my opinions, my own opinions, I thought about them, but if what you say makes sense to me, I'm also ready to change my opinions. That's what an intellectual exchange is. Whereas where we are right now in the world, it's just whoever speaks louder and in an angrier tone seems to win. That's scary. Within a novel, things aren't like that. Novels are about nuances, they're about ambiguity. It doesn't mean you don't have an opinion as a writer, but what I like is to open up conversations and to write about difficult issues, but always leave the answers to the reader. Because I know every reader is going to come up with their own answers. You know? They're unique, like our fingerprints. I have met couples who have been married to each other for over 40 years. They read the same novel. One of them loves it, the other one not so. I have met friends who know each other's all their secrets. they'll have completely different characters in the same book. Why? Because the reader is never passive. We bring our own gaze into the story. I'm very much aware of that. But I think my job as a writer is to be aware of silences, is to open up conversations, just respect that pluralism that exists inside the bigger canvas of a novel.
Absolutely, and the great book also has a lot of different perspectives, and this means also it produces different receptions. You also can read it in different ways. That's all about interpretation and hermeneutics. Otherwise, it's boring. It's one message, it's clear, it's statistics, it's facts and figures. But a great novel like yours, or James Joyce, or Marcel Proust, you have so many ways to identify with certain scenes or persons, and at the same time, other readers perceive it totally different. But you are the creator of the universe, you are godmother, you decide what's happening in the novel, you let them live or die. Isn't that fantastic?
You know, I think as novelists we have inflated egos, you know, because we tend to think we are small gods. So when you finish a novel, I think it's better for the mind to completely get out of that zone, just like a pendulum. And just remember that you're a student of life. We have to be two things, in my opinion, as writers. We need to be very good readers, just keep reading across the board, and good listeners. Try to listen what people are saying, with what kind of emotions they're saying. So the learning process is ongoing, and I think it's endless to be aware of that. Also unlearning. Sometimes we need to do a bit of unlearning as well.
What do you mean by that?
Because we all grow up in a particular community, society, our own little tribes, taking it for granted. You know, we always hear prejudices, stereotypes, generalizations about this group or that group. Sometimes you need to unlearn what you have learned in order to be able to learn again. So I'm also aware of that.
Fresh point of view, to be a little bit relaxed, to step back and then reset.
Yeah, a little bit of cognitive distance. Right. But also I think I'm someone who very much believes in interdisciplinary conversations. And I don't think we have enough of that. So, you know, not only East-West, but across the board, fiction and non-fiction. And to be honest, I feel a bit sad when sometimes readers, some readers, it's usually male readers who do this.
Oh, really?
Yes, they come and they say, you know, it's interesting, let's say, book festivals are interesting, but so much is happening in the world. I want to know what's happening in the world. So I read finance, I read politics, I read philosophy, I read about technology, you know, cryptocurrency. But my wife reads fiction. I don't have time for fiction. You know, she reads fiction.
She can tell him her experiences with your novels then, and then they find together in a different way. It's also nice, you know.
I think inside a novel there is psychology, there is philosophy,
Absolutely.
There is history, there's, you know, all of that. But perhaps more importantly, there's emotional intelligence. And I don't know a single human being in this world who doesn't need emotional intelligence, whatever we do.
How can we train emotional intelligence? Can we train that? Can children train that? Can parents train that? Yeah. What's your recommendation?
Yes, I mean, first of all, we need to stop seeing emotions as a sign of weakness. Right?
Do we?
We do, all the time. And I think in different ways, where I come from in Turkey, some people think that women are emotional, men are rational. I think that's nonsense. As human beings, we're all emotional creatures. We connect through emotions, and we remember through emotions. But also across many parts of the world, especially in male-dominated areas, like politics, for instance, I think there's a lot of pressure on women politicians to always look robust, don't show your feelings, otherwise people will think you're weak. We need to get that narrative out. You know, I think emotions are a source of power, can be a source of power.
How can we implant that? We often refer to we in politics, in economics, in climate change, and whatever it is, we should, we have to be careful, and so world community. But normally, as in reality, this we is divided in so many sub-we's with different interests, you know. So this is sometimes, I feel, if people talk too much about we, it's a little bit cheating. You know what I mean? I
do know what you mean. But I always try to keep in mind one basic fact that I have observed. Wherever in the world we have seen a rise in populism and populist authoritarianism, There is a reason why demagogues love to create division, hostility, tension, antagonism. So if you listen to them, every speech they give, everything they do is in that direction, to stoke more hostility, because they know they will benefit from constant tension. And if a society is atomized, of course, Hannah Arendt was warning us about this, wasn't she? I mean, when a society is so atomized, so broken into its smaller components, that's a very dangerous thing. So we might be critical of so many things, but at the same time, never lose sight of this. How do I communicate with people who might think differently, speak differently, vote differently, you know? How do I try to understand? And again, it comes back to stories. If I know people's stories, I can understand better.
Right.
If I don't know stories, it's just an abstraction. It's only numbers. And I really think there's a relation between numbers and numbness. You know, just numbers, it doesn't stay with us. Whether it's 5,000 refugees who have lost their lives, 50,000 refugees, the mind doesn't register the difference. But if I know their stories, then I start to feel something.
That's a good point. Do you perceive yourself as a good observer of other human beings?
A good server?
A good a good observer.
Oh, observer, sorry.
Yeah. You watch them closely?
I watch human beings, of course, but I also watch myself, in the sense that I observe myself, my own contradictions, my own weaknesses. So I don't think observing means you're above.
No, just watching what they do, and then you put them in their novels and they live or die.
Yeah, of course.
This kind of thing, no? It's important. Otherwise,
it is important.
Otherwise, literature is very abstract.
Of course.
Another question, we talked about politics, and do you think men are easier to seduce, to have been fans of kind of totalitarian or dictatorial habits or populism or so than women?
That's such an interesting question. I think women are usually memory keepers. You know, where I come from, Turkey, of course, has a very long history, rich history, but long and rich history doesn't mean strong memory. And I think just the opposite, we're a society of collective amnesia.
In Turkey now, especially.
Yeah, and I think the easiest thing in Turkey is to forget. So these voids, you know, these gaps in history, and something has to fill those gaps. So those gaps are usually filled in by nationalist, ultranationalist, Islamist narratives that say, you know, whatever we did was always great, etc. But when you talk to women, like my grandmother, they were memory keepers. So that, to me, is interesting. Women are better at peace building. And it's so sad that in many parts of the world where we see conflict after conflict, women don't have equal voice at the table where the decisions are being made. So I think we're at this moment in time, and we will see the results, because the pandemic is affecting women more than men. The pandemic is affecting young people more than older people, and minorities, you know. Also climate change. If we care about climate change, we have to care about gender injustice. The United Nations report recently showed that 80% of people who have been displaced so far because of climate destruction are women and children.
It's only the beginning.
It's already beginning. So all I'm trying to say is we are at this moment in time when I think women need to be at the center and front of change. Young people have to be at the center and front, and definitely minorities have to have a louder voice, bigger voice.
That is also a political task, no? You have to find politicians who promote that, otherwise, well, in Switzerland it's easy, but in Turkey it's a little bit more difficult, I think, no?
Yeah, you said it very politely, it's very difficult in Turkey.
We are always very diplomatic with our distinguished guests, with very few exceptions. You refer to Turkey now. I mean, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we traveled to Turkey, Istanbul, fantastic city, full of life and enlightenment and people who were curious, artists and intellectuals and businessmen. And this changed within a rather short time to a very, very different state. Why is that so?
True. Yeah, it's a long process. As you know, we have a government that's been in power for almost 19 years now. And we have seen, as time went by, monopolization of power. So first gradually, and then with a bewildering speed, what little fledgling democracy we had, I'm not saying Turkey was a great democracy, but there were steps in that direction, that started to decline. And we started going backwards and backwards. So what happened is we slid into more ultranationalism, more Islamism, religiosity, but also populism and populist authoritarianism. I think whenever this happens, we will also see an increase in sexism. We will also see an increase in homophobia. We will also see an increase in misogyny. And that's not a coincidence because they always go hand in hand. We have a massive problem with gender violence and femicides. But this is a government that abandons Istanbul Convention, which is a treaty we need. Absolutely. It's not enough to sign it, you need to implement it. And if I may add this also, I think countries like Turkey also show us that democracy is a very delicate ecosystem of checks and balances. It is much more fragile than we assumed many years ago. It requires to be nurtured, nourished. It's not enough to have a ballot box or elections to sustain a democracy.
Right.
Turkey has elections. Turkey today is not a democracy. In order to have a democracy, in addition to the ballot box, I have a lot of respect for the ballot box. But all I'm saying is, in addition to that, you need rule of law. You need separation of powers. Nobody in this world, no person, no party, and no company, no tech company should have extreme power. So you need separation of powers, checks and balances, definitely independent academia, free, diverse media, women's rights, minority rights. With all those components, I think a democracy can survive. When the components are broken, that system is not democracy, it's majoritarianism. And from majoritarianism into authoritarianism, it's a very quick fall.
But there must have been a certain appeal for many people to what Erdogan is doing. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. No, this kind of populism is you have the people who somehow you need, you manipulate or whatever you do, but still you have to find a lot of people who support that. Otherwise, he would wipe away.
Of course, there are people who support, but their numbers are not huge. And I think when we're talking about countries like Turkey, we need to bear in mind that it's very complex. It's a very multi-layered society. And there are many people in Turkey who are Democrats, who have a more global vision, who want a proper democracy, and who want diversity to be respected. Maybe we don't hear their voices as much. Maybe they don't make it into newspapers, but they exist. And I think we should never forget that they exist. So when you listen to women, when you listen to young people in Turkey, when you listen to arts and culture, but also minorities, whether it's ethnic minorities like Kurds or sexual minorities like the LGBTQ community, you realize what a complicated, what a complex country this is. Also, of course, if the opposition is divided, that also is another thing. As I mentioned, if all the other components are broken, that's also important. So it's not only just one single factor.
Yeah, it comes all together.
What
you actually would need is strong women to go into politics, but this is maybe in 50 years. What's your prediction?
I wish we had more women in politics, and I want women of all backgrounds to be in politics. In Turkey, actually, you will see when you go or when you connect with the people, there are lots of women who are very vocal and amazing spirits, and they're very active in media, they're active in academia or medicine, art, in all walks of life. But there's one field in which women are almost non-existent, and that's politics.
Exactly.
Local, regional, national politics. Of course there are women politicians, but I'm talking about as you go upwards, the echelons of political decision-making, that's not only a male-dominated world, but dominated by men who have a very conservative, nationalistic, and very patriarchal, macho worldview. And that changes everything.
This is totally different in Switzerland. The absolute contradiction. A last question, and I will open to you, ladies and gentlemen. Speaking of Islam and its derivative of Islamism, is Islam ever capable to undergo enlightenment? Because it's not only a religion, it's a whole concept of living and of life. It's much more. And it really goes on many different levels.
You know, I appreciate the question, but I think when we talk about Islam, when we talk about Muslims in the world, we tend to sometimes, many times, lump together everyone, you know, within the same box. I personally am not a religious person, and I make a distinction between religiosity and spirituality. And collectivistic religions, organized religions, they're not close to my heart at all. Any worldview that divides humanity into us versus them and assumes that us is closer to truth, closer to God, or us is better than them is not close to my heart. What I'm interested in is, you know, spiritual journeys. And everybody's spiritual journey is different. You might start that spiritual journey as a Buddhist, you might end up as a Jewish mystic, or vice versa.
Both are very peaceful, yes.
What do I know? You know, who am I to judge? So that's very different. I like agnosticism. I like the kind of mysticism, you know, the mystics who were a little bit of misfits. They were walking a thin line between faith and doubt. I like people who can say, I don't know. You know, when was the last time we ever said, I don't know? We live in a world that gives the impression that we know everything. If you ask me something, if I don't know the answer, I can Google it. And in the next 5 minutes, I'll be able to say a few things, giving me the impression that I know the answer, but in fact, I don't know. So all I'm saying is, within agnosticism and mysticism that is close to heterodoxy, there is that kind of, I think, humility. And I'm interested in that. Now, coming back to your question, we generalize very easily, you know? And when we talk about Muslims, we're talking about so many different interpretations, so many different people from so many different walks of life. And of course, it can be compatible with democracy. Otherwise, we are excluding millions and millions of people. And that's a worldview that is not close to my heart.
I couldn't agree more, but it was not about the people, it was about the concept, the religion itself, the structure. Like, you know, the militant Christians of the Middle Ages, and so there was also foe and friend, enemy and friend, and you are on the right side, and then it's good, and you are not, and then we kill you. We had our jihad too. So the question is, but we underwent Christianity, a huge process of enlightenment, and that's what possibly we would wish for Islam too.
That's what we need. We need enlightenment, we need reforms. I think these are incredibly important. We need critical thinking. We need nuanced thinking. And we also need to understand that pluralism is important. But we also need one more thing, secularism. I think secularism is so important, especially for women. So, you know, religion dominating the rules of the state at every level, that's something else.
That's what I mean.
So, of course. So we do need reforms, and we do need secularism across the world, though.
Right.
Yeah.
You will be the Voltaire of Islam. No? We have full hope. So, ladies and gentlemen, please ask your questions. Seize the opportunity. Elif will not be here so quickly again. Who wants to put the first question? Cannot be that you have no questions. Here, down there.
Is it on? Okay. Thank you so much for that talk. It was really got to my heart a lot. You talked a bit about young people and dealing with climate change, and I just recently dropped out of activism because I couldn't deal with it anymore. And it's kind of difficult to be in this situation and hear you talk about it in such an inspiring way, and it kind of draws me back into it, but I don't know what to do with it. Because to be honest, like to really face these issues and really try to do something about it, it doesn't necessarily make you function more. So I would really like to get your advice as somebody who seems very wise to me. What should I do?
I so appreciate your question, you know, and I understand your frustration because, and if I hear you correctly, you know, you put so much effort into it, you put your emotions into it, right? You try, you can do other things with your time. And surely you give it your time, you give it your heart, and there's something very genuine there. And you meet with people who are just like you, and you raise your voices, But then those voices are not heard by people who are taking the decisions, right? And so that disappointment and understanding that actually we're in a state of emergency right now. You know, it's an urgency. So it is not something that's happening in 100 times. It's happening right now as we're speaking. This summer, the wildfires in Turkey, in Greece, in California, you know, the floods in Germany, it is happening, unraveling as we're speaking. And yet, we tend to pretend, or our politicians, the elite, political elite, tend to pretend as if this is someone else's problem and you can keep other people's problems at bay if you erect higher walls. And that's an illusion. But I think maybe we need to understand that sometimes, again, feeling anxious, worried, or even hopeless is part of this journey. And tomorrow we need to allow our mood to change. I think we are at a moment in which none of us has the luxury of being apolitical. None of us has the luxury of being disconnected. And also, we cannot only focus on one issue. You know, we can't be single-issue people. Again, that's why I said if we care about climate, then we care about inequalities. If we care about inequalities, then we need to talk about racial inequality, gender inequality, but also digital inequalities, and so on, class inequality. So I'm someone who very much believes that we need to revive ecofeminism, you know, the kind of ecofeminism that connects the dots. But I hope you won't lose the desire to share your voice in the public space, because we need women and we need young people. And there isn't enough young people and women within the public space. And if we raise our voices, I honestly believe it will put a lot of pressure on even the politicians who refuse to hear. And we have to do that. We have to do that for our planet, for ourselves, and for our common humanity. So I don't know if that gives you hope, but all I'm trying to say is I also share your frustration, but I think frustration is part of this journey too.
Next question, please. Here.
Just a follow-up question. So how much of that pressure you mentioned right now, the female pressure, Turkey needs?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. I mean, in Turkey, of course, if you're following, despite all the challenges and difficulties, there is a vibrant women's movement. And I have so much respect for these women who are, you know, demonstrating on the streets, who are active on social media. Social media is a very tricky place. I'm an introvert. I don't like social media much. However, I'm also aware that social media is a bit like the moon. It definitely has a bright side, and it also has a dark side. And because we have spoken about its bright side so much and for so long, we need to focus on its dark side as well. But basically what I'm trying to say is, in countries where there's no proper freedom of speech, people do connect via social media. In countries where the public space is male-dominated, women try to carve out a space for themselves in digital space, you know? So I don't belittle that side of social media. And I have a lot of respect for women in Turkey, Turkish, Kurdish, you know, Armenian, Jewish, Alevi, you know, women of all backgrounds who are nonetheless raising their voices. The kind of women's movement that I long for is not the one that retreats, but the one that opens up conversations. That definitely goes hand in hand with LGBTQ plus rights communities, you know, their rights, but also brings men on board. Because what I've seen is in a country that is acutely patriarchal, of course women are unhappy, but men are unhappy as well. And masculinity is like a straitjacket. So if you're a young man who doesn't conform to the given description of masculinity, your life is going to be difficult too. And that's why it's important to have these conversations together and talk about masculinity, the construction of masculinity. So all I'm trying to say is there are these conversations in Turkey, but of course it's difficult.
Next question, please. Here. 2.
I have maybe a quite different question, but I would still like to know how you start writing. Do you have inspiring places where you start writing? How do you know when that this is going to be the start of your novel? Mm-hmm. Are you always satisfied with the end of your novel?
That's a lot of questions.
I know.
Thank you so much. They're brilliant questions. You know, I started writing at an early age. I've been writing since my childhood. But that's not because I was planning to become a novelist. I didn't know you could dedicate your life to books. I had no such role models around me. It was more like walking in the dark. I needed books because I thought life was very boring. So that's how I started writing, trying to just imagine a different world. Storyland, for me, was much more real, was much more interesting than the so-called real life that I found myself in. So it was more like an existential need. The desire to become a novelist came to me around the time I was 19 years old. From then onwards, I knew that, you know, I wanted to try this, to go in that direction. But the need for books preceded that. With regards to, are you satisfied, you know, with what you're writing? I think writing is so hard. And sometimes you feel like, okay, you have a great story, and then the next week it collapses. And you go through these valleys of doubt, self-doubt. And it never gets easier. Whether it's your first book, 5th book, 10th book, you suffer. But that suffering is also part of the journey. How do I write? I don't like silence. You know, I usually write with music. I like to listen to loud music with high energy, so I'm a big metal fan. Really? But I love to...
Like Marcel Proust, no?
Like Marcel Proust. So I love usually Scandinavian, Viking, you know, metal, industrial metal. And I listen to the same song on a loop like 70 times, and that helps me to zoom out. That's how I write, yeah.
So you see, it's all about learning by doing, no? There was another question here.
Hello, thank you very much for your present and your presentations. I don't really have a question, but rather a comment, because you were talking about building relationships and connecting to other people. And the other day I was listening to a podcast with a non-binary person, and they shared their struggle in life with getting abused, like on a daily basis on the streets and all those kind of things. And that person made a distinction between creating an understanding, like on an intellectual level, and having compassion for someone. Mm. And they said that it's almost impossible for, as an example, for a binary person to create an understanding for a non-binary person because we just can't. But you can always move like on the level of compassion for another human being. And so in a way, for me, it simplified some things, because I feel that humans, we always try to understand, but sometimes it's just so complicated. And then sometimes we have to switch from the intellectual to the heart level and just show compassion.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment. I think, you know, the mind is more limited, isn't it? Because it's more shaped by our own upbringing, our own little dogmas that we take for granted. But as you said, the heart, I think, is wider. It's more endless. It's more capable of connecting, understanding, in fact. So I'm a big believer in empathy. One thing, and I know this is not what you're talking about, but one thing, if I may add, just to follow up, sometimes it's a discussion in literature, like, can a male writer write about the female experience, for instance? I think it's possible. Or you don't need to be, for instance, Turkish in order to be able to write a novel about Turkey. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, if there's a genuine connection, if there's a connection from the heart, it doesn't have to be part of your identity. So I want to encourage, in literature, I think there has to be a more nomadic, you know, we can have nomadic journeys, But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be aware of the inequalities within the publishing world. And I think it's important to also, at the same time, defend giving more voice to people whose voices we rarely hear, like the non-binary, for instance, author or poet you talked about. Because there are all these glass walls that we don't see from a distance until we bump into them, run into them. So I think in the publishing world, we need to change lots of things. We need to have more minority authors being supported, empowered, but at the same time, keep it open, the possibility that, you know, maybe one day I might write a book that takes place in Switzerland. You see what I mean? So it doesn't have to be part of my identity if I genuinely feel it in my heart. And it will be the readers who will judge whether my connection is genuine or not. When they see the book or when they read the book, they will know. So again, it comes back to connections from the heart being much more crucial.
2 questions there.
I have a question regarding your role as a public intellectual, not only in Britain but in Turkey. What are the kind of challenges that are facing when you talk or be in Turkey as well as in Britain?
Thank you. Thank you.
Concrete challenges that you, based on your personal experiences.
Thank you. Really, really appreciate the question. Completely different challenges. Because in Turkey, you know, women are not regarded as public intellectuals, to be honest, until they are deemed to be old in the eyes of the society. This is a very patriarchal world we're talking about, but within our patriarchal society, we have matriarchal households, which means we respect our grandmothers in Turkey. A woman is not respected for her opinions until she is regarded as old, which is by then you are desexualized, defeminized in the eyes of the society. You're not regarded as a woman anymore. You're a different category. So are women regarded as public intellectuals? I'm not sure. I care about public intellectuals, and this is another challenge in the UK, because in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, intellectual is a negative word. And if you use it about someone, actually you use it in a not sarcastic way, but maybe there's a bit of irony in it. And nobody calls themselves in the Anglo-Saxon world public intellectual, which is interesting. France isn't like that. Russia isn't like that. Turkey isn't like that. I mean, we incarcerate our intellectuals, but we at least recognize that they're intellectuals as long as they're male. So it's interesting. You see, there are different traditions. But what I'm trying to say is, I think we need public intellectuals who are women. We need public intellectuals who are young. We need public intellectuals who come from minority backgrounds. So this is not the privilege of, you know, people who are above a certain age, of a certain gender, and who have graduated from certain universities. There are different paths to knowledge. So I do have respect. I'm not saying I'm a public intellectual, but I do have a lot of respect for people who are, and I really think we need more women to step up and step into these public conversations.
There was another question down there.
Regarding you writing in Turkish and English, like, how do you decide what language to write in? And like, does it feel different to write in Turkish or in English? Like,
beautiful question. You know, I love language. For me, it's not an instrument. It's not like a fork and knife that I use and I put aside. I see language as a space, as a zone of existence I enter in. And of course, as you can hear in my mispronunciation, the mistakes that I make, I am not a native speaker. English for me is an acquired language, and I'm an immigrant in this language. I started learning English when I was in Spain. At the time, Spanish became my second language. Turkish is my mother tongue. English became my third language. But it never abandoned me. And I would always read in this language, you know, take little notes, write poems back then, but keep it to myself. All my earlier novels were written in Turkish first. And I love language so passionately, this is a big controversial issue in Turkey, that I love using both old words and new words. You know, as you know, we have taken out so many words coming from Arabic, Persian, but I love words. I don't want to take out anything. I love multiplicity. So my Turkish vocabulary was rich, if I may put it this way. But of course, writing in your mother tongue is easier. However, about 15 years ago, I switched completely. And I started writing in English first. It was more like an animal instinct rather than a rational decision. It was more like a leap in the dark, because I felt like I needed a bit more freedom. Being a novelist in Turkey is so heavy. And I think being a woman novelist is even heavier. And sometimes writing in another language gives me a sense of freedom. Right, one of my earlier novels, The Bastard of Istanbul, had I written that book in Turkish, it might have been a different book. Even the word bastard in Turkish is heavy. But when I said it in English, it didn't feel heavy. You see what I mean? So writing in another language gives you a cognitive distance. It's like taking a step back and looking at a painting. And in a strange way, actually, you can see it better. All I can say is, over the years, I realized if my writing has melancholy, sorrow, longing, I still find these things much easier to express in Turkish. But when it comes to humor, which I love, adore, I think humor is our oxygen. Humor is easier in English to me. Irony is easier in English, and satire is easier in English. So I feel connected to each language in a different way. My connection with the Turkish language is more emotional. My connection with the English language is more cerebral. And I feel like I need both.
Beautiful. Here, please. So a lot of questions now. Great.
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I was wondering, what is, in your opinion, a good role model that is also inclusive to people who have, or maybe appear to have, a different identity than oneself?
Beautiful, thank you. You know, I use the word role model with a little bit of caution, because maybe I approach it slightly differently. I don't believe in heroes. You know, I don't believe in heroes in literature as either. So for me, every human being is full of contradictions, is changing, more fluid. That's something that I would love to be talked about. You know, you use the word inclusive. I think it's so important. How do we create inclusive spaces? How do we learn to be less judgmental? You know, try to understand each other's stories, where we're coming from into different decisions. So that kind of understanding, that kind of emotional intelligence, if I may put it this way, is something that I would love to nurture. But it doesn't happen unless we have conversations like this. It doesn't happen unless we have art and culture. And it really breaks my heart that, especially with the pandemic, many politicians, including in the UK, they started acting as if art is a luxury. You know, it's not an essential thing. Libraries can be shut down. At a time of economic difficulty, festivals can be, cancelled. But when you take culture out of a society, the divisions become sharper. It has long-term repercussions. So I think we need spaces like this in order to foster the kind of thinking that you and I are longing for.
Don't you think that Don Quixote is an honest hero?
Don Quixote is an honest hero, yes. Sancho Panza as well. Yeah.
Can we agree on that?
Can we?
Can we agree on that?
We can agree on that.
Great. Next question.
Hello. Are you hopeful for Turkey's future?
Tough question you ask me.
Short and bold.
Short and bold question you ask me. Of course I'm hopeful for Turkey's future. Why? Because I think, I never lose sight of the people. As I mentioned, when you talk to women, when you see the women who are out there demonstrating, when you see the minorities who are trying to make their voices heard, when you talk to young people in Turkey, students, university students, high school students, that gives me a lot of hope. But I'm not going to mince my words when I think about Turkey's politics, when I think about Turkey's politicians, when I think about how all these democratic institutions and norms have been broken, I feel very depressed and I feel very demoralized. So I have mixed feelings in that regard.
Maybe one last question, because Elif has to leave tomorrow at 5 o'clock in the morning. Okay, 2. Here.
Thank you very much for your speech and for everything you're sharing with us. I'd like to ask you, how do you find your voices from your book? How do you approach people in life? Yeah. Because you say you're an introvert person, and I'm Swiss. I lived in many places, and when I'm going through Switzerland, I'm a musician, or through Zurich now, I sometimes approach people because I think it helps to make this wall fall, which is kind of, in the Swiss mentality, they're not very open. Yeah. I'm not saying I'm extremely open, but sometimes it's too much for some people. Yeah. But I just want to know, how do you do it as an introvert person? How do you go towards people? How do you find your voices from your book?
Thank you so much. You know, I read. I try to read as much as I can. To me, this is very important. You know, you don't always write, or you don't always include in a novel what you've written on that day, but I do my best to make reading continuous. If I haven't been able to read during the day, I try to read at night. And I try to read across the board, not only from one genre, but multiple genres, not only from one culture, but multiple cultures. So try to have hybrids, eclectic sources of knowledge. I'm a big believer in that, you know? But I'm going to come to that. But second thing is, go also directly to the people. And when we go talk to people, but people of all walks of life, all ages, you know, we have something to learn from every single human being on this planet. I try to be a good listener. And I try to listen to two things, not what they're telling me only, but how they're saying what they're saying, with what kind of emotions and what kind of silences. We didn't get a chance to talk about this, but in this late novel, recent novel, The Island of Missing Trees, there's a lot of emphasis on silences. You know, we always talk about family stories, but we also have family silences. There's a lot of emphasis on inherited pain. Sometimes people don't speak directly, but they're trying to express. If I may give you a quick example, sometimes food is a language too. You know, early on I talked about my grandmother. Women like her, you know, they experienced lots of hardships, and they want to tell you about them, but they don't know how to. So instead they feed you, you know? And they have this naive belief that if we all sit around the same table and break bread together, maybe there'll be less misunderstanding and hostilities in this world. The reason why I'm giving this example is sometimes food is a language. Sometimes people speak through their gestures. So I try to pay attention to the absences and silences as well, if that makes sense. So that kind of listening.
Absolutely. Fascinating, absolutely. So now it's really the last. Okay, 2, but please short. Here and down there.
So, first of all, thank you for your talk. I was really touched by the concepts that you presented. First of all, that you said that you also listen to the silence in the periphery, and this concept of numbness maybe being the opposite of kindness, and identity as something that shouldn't be constructed around a singular thing. So my question is about something that it was also part of your stories, which I tried to connect it to these 3 concepts that you presented. The genital cutting of boys, and you also talked about it, you told these stories in a very authentic way. I know this because I know men who have these stories too, and that they are with some of them are my friends, and I have to say that what I find out authentic is the silencing of their emotions, their pain. That's something that I felt that you listened to, and they become numb after that, and they built their identity around it, the construction of the masculinity. So I don't share their background. My background is Jewish, but I share their suffering, and it took a long time for me, a painful process, to become aware of this and liberate myself of the patriarchal concept behind it, the logic behind it. So my question, sorry, it's very long, maybe the longest one, but in your understanding, how much of an impediment, of an obstacle is this norm which affects East and West to equality, to women's rights, and to secularism?
First of all, I want to thank you. I don't think it's easy to talk about, you know, your own upbringing, to talk about circumcision, to talk about your own emotions in a public space. That takes courage, and I really appreciate that you share this, also because we never encourage men to share such conversations. And I think it's important. So the way I hear what you're telling me is, again, coming back to masculinity being almost like a straitjacket imposed on us. If I may very quickly focus on that, one of my earlier novels is called Honor, and it deals with this notion of honor. And when I was writing that novel, I had to do a lot of research about honor killings, honor crimes. What I found is so heartbreaking, especially younger boys who are underage, constantly bombarded with this construct of honor, that they have a duty to keep an eye on the modesty of their sisters, on the modesty of their mothers. You know, it's their responsibility, it's their tribal or family honor. That kind of pressure on those young boys is not helping either. So not only we're not allowing boys and men not to show their emotions, but we are pushing them in a direction that not only harms the people around them, but also harms them within. All of that needs to be questioned. All of that needs to be changed. And I think it is possible if we continue these conversations. That's why I think we need to keep talking about masculinity, a particular type of masculinity that is imposed from above on all of us needs to be dismantled. That's my opinion.
The last question.
I will keep it short, and I'm from Afghanistan, and as an international citizen, as you mentioned, my Swiss identity is like a good life, being in a prestigious university, but a lot of my friends, my Afghan identity is suffering. And the question is, a lot of women, or all of the women in Afghanistan, the girls cannot go to school, cannot work, cannot go to universities. They are under constant suffering. The question is, what can they do to tackle the situation, and what we can do for them as international citizens? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You know, I feel angry. I feel sad, but I feel anger when I think about women and minorities and girls in Afghanistan and human rights defenders in Afghanistan. There is this notion in international relations that there's a realpolitik, and realpolitik is so important. And realpolitik says, if you want to make a good omelette with, you know, long-term impact, it's okay to break a few eggs. And those eggs that will be broken will always be women and minorities. What I'm trying to say is, women and minorities are always regarded as casualties. And this is precisely what's happening in Afghanistan. And the way the Western world has abandoned women and human rights defenders and minorities and girls and children, I find it unacceptable. And you're right, we need to keep Afghanistan constantly on our minds. I also find it unacceptable that we only spoke about Afghanistan for 3 days, 4 days, and by the 5th day we had forgotten. That is how short our attention span is, but people are suffering there. You know, so it's not over. And there are many people who are trying to get out. There are women, judges, journalists, you know, women who took a very active role in the public space in the last decade, who now can't leave their homes because of fear of being killed. So we have a responsibility as human to human, not in the name of any ideology, not because the Western world is superior. I don't buy into that at all. but as human beings, we have a responsibility to each other. So I think you're very right to share this, and I feel ashamed. That's all I'm going to say.
Absolutely, and Iran is also not much better. Okay, here we go. A short glance at remaining lectures. Time runs out, but we have to admit, it was really a rich program this fall. So, last normal conference by Bernard Picard, the fantastic guy who explores this heaven, whatever, wide above. Psychologist and motivator, is also a great entertainer. Don't miss this chance. The guy is normally not here around. The last SIAF talks directly from the studio of Global Center of Swissry, Paul Bulke, chairman of the board of directors of Nestlé, in conversation with, again, our Katja Centinetta. And on the 29th of November, Professor Dan Diener, eminent Israeli historian, in the Literaturhaus about his newest book. We are already working on the spring semester of next year and hope to show you some names, maybe already on the 23rd of November. We don't know how it works. You have to understand, with the restrictions of COVID and other uncertainties, it gets more and more difficult to prepare the program in advance, so sometimes we have to improvise, but you are also good improvisers, and the most important thing is that you're here. As I always say, my wife says, don't tell them all the time, but we do it for you. So, now the gift, Elif. This is a frightening tradition, because we surprise our distinguished guests with, well, whatever it is. So, this is nice, no? It's red and white. It's not the Danish colors, but it's the Swiss colors. And there are also cows on it. But inside is, okay, if I would have known that you are addicted to Nordic heavy metal, that would have been an alternative, maybe a voucher for listening to a live band before you start your next novel. We can consider that next time. Was a little bit shocked, but at the same time inspired. I try my next book to do that with that too, and I will let you know what happens.
Let me know.
Yes, okay.
Let me know.
Yes, no, it's a magic bowl, crystal ball, and you know you can treat it in different ways. So if you look now at what we can see, for instance, if you make like this, it's the storm you described, which covers the world with much problems, and it's really, it's difficult, you know, it's, problems and uncertainties and so, but after a while, it settles down, and look at that, you even can see yourself. And I mean, sometimes it's really easy to change the world in a bowl. And you even see a mountain and a tiny, tiny little Swiss flag, because we also improve on several topics. So again, all the best. It was absolutely fantastic. It was spectacular, but it was also deep insights of an absolutely great writer, and we saw also with the quality and the intensity of the questions and the human concerns that this was very, very exceptional. Thank you again, and you come back, please.
Thank you. I would love to come back. Thank you so much. Thank you.